technical hitch there, but we'll get over that. It's hard to believe that it's actually been a year since we had our last full meeting. Things have happened since then. And I thought I should bring you up to date on how Paddy is getting along. Now Paddy and Mick, we were talking about the holidays, and Mick says to Paddy, "What are you doing this year for your holidays?" Paddy says, "I'm going to do something different this year." "Like what?" says Mick. But Paddy says, "You remember, 2 years ago, I went to the Costa del Sol, and when I came home, Mary Ann told me she was pregnant." He says, "Last year, I went over to Disney World in Florida, and when I came home, Mary Ann told me she was pregnant." So Mick says, "So what are you going to do different this year?" Paddy says, "I'm going to bring her with me." Can you hear me then? They had an old uncle who was a sailor, and one of the things that he put in his will was that he would like to be buried at sea. So the day arrived that he had to get buried at sea, and Paddy and Mick put him in their own boat and started to row out to bury him at sea. And after they'd been rowing for about 10 or 15 minutes, Mick says to Paddy, "What do you think, Paddy? Will this do?" Paddy says, "I don't know, about to see how deep it is first." So he says to Mick, "Jump you over there to see how deep it is." And Mick jumped over, and the water only came up to his knees. "Will that do, Paddy?" "Oh, not at all," says Paddy, "we'll have to go out further than that." So they rowed out another bit, and he said to Mick, "You better jump out now and see how deep we are." And the water came up to Mick's waist, and he says, "What do you think, Paddy?" Paddy says, "I don't think that'll do." He says, "We need to go out another bit." So they rowed on for another while, and Paddy says to Mick, "Jump out there now and see how we're doing." And he jumped out, and the water came up to his chest. He says to Paddy, "What do you think will this do?" Paddy says it will. Mick says, "Give me the spade." They were Irish. Oh, well, I think better tell one that Dean can relate to. The Paddy was a qualified electrician, and he had run out of work in Ireland, so he decided he'd emigrate to America. And he got a job in San Quentin as an electrician. And he had been there for a week or two, and the warden came up to him one day and he said, "Paddy, we're having trouble with the electric chair, will you take a look at it?" Paddy says, "I will." So away he went down to the room where the electric chair is, and about an hour later the warden came down to see how he was getting on. And Paddy had the chair to bits. He had a leg here and an arm there, and he had wires all over the place. And the warden says, "My goodness, Paddy, what's happening here?" Paddy says, "You're a lucky man." He says, "You are a lucky man." The warden says, "Why's that, Paddy?" Paddy says, "Do you see that chair? That was a bloody death trap," he says. I have to tell you about Paddy's son. He went to Belfast and he met this beautiful girl in Belfast. And she was in bad way, big distress. After talking to her for a few minutes, he discovered that her mother was in hospital and she needed about 50 quid for medicine to make her mother better. So he gave her the 50 quid, and never had done this. He couldn't believe how generous she was in all the things that she done for him. And he couldn't wait to get home to tell his mother what had happened. And he was telling his mother, and his mother says to him, he was called Sean, she says, "Sean, these city girls, you couldn't watch them." She says, "You couldn't believe what they're at." Oh, he says, "There's nothing wrong with this girl, she's a decent girl. She actually plays rugby." The mother says, "How do you know that, Sean?" He says, "Well, she told me she was a hooker." What else have we got here? Paddy was lying up in hospital. He had 2 black eyes and swollen lips and 2 or 3 teeth missing, and Mick went to see him. And he says to Paddy, "What in the name of God happened to you, Paddy?" Paddy said, "It was Mary Ann," he says. He says, why did you do that? Well, he says, we were talking the other night, and Miriam said to me, Paddy, how many girls have you slept with? And he says, I told her, Miriam, you're the only girl that I slept with. I was wide awake with all the rest of them. And I have to look at the sheets now to see what my old groups are. The old mind isn't as good as it used to be, you see. When I told them years ago at home I was going to be a comedian, and they all laughed. They're not laughing now. Paddy was coming home from the pub one afternoon and spent the whole morning in the pub. And on his way home, he came across this priest down in the river, and he was baptizing the newly converted. And Paddy happened to stumble in beside him, and the priest grabbed him to the back of the neck and stuck his head down under the water. And Paddy fought and he spluttered for 2 minutes till he got his head up. And the priest says to him, have you found Jesus yet? And Paddy says no, so he stuck his head down again. And after a bit of splutting and splutting, he got up. And the priest says to him, have you found Jesus yet? No, I haven't, says Paddy. Are you sure this is where he fell in? Let's see what we have now. They were in Paddy and Mick were alone one time. They're going down the street, and they're going past this shop window, and in the window were these suits and shirts, and a big notice up saying suits at £6, shirts at £2. Paddy says to Mick, we'll go in and buy a few of these in there. So they went into the shop, and he says to the guy behind the counter, he says, could we have a couple of those suits, he said, and a couple of the shirts? And the boy looked at him, and he says, you're from Ireland, aren't you? Yes, says Paddy, how did you know? He says, this is a dry cleaners. Paddy's daughter landed up at the house one day with her boyfriend, and Paddy couldn't believe what he'd seen. This guy had long hair, dishevelled, and had a long beard. And Paddy took a look at him and he says, how much do you earn in a year? He says, about 35 grand. Paddy says, Jesus, that's not bad. He said, you count that along with my daughter's 30? He says, that's big money. He says, I've already counted it. He says, have you got a house? He says, I have. But he says, where do you live? He says, here, I'm moving in here tomorrow. I think I lost you there. No, I think I've been exhausted my jokes, and I'll try and sing a few songs, and you may realise I have a bad cold and I don't know how long it'll last, but I'll try a few songs. Thank you very much.